let's start with the first session. Yeah, it's great to kick us off. It's a pleasure. Yeah, as I mentioned before, my name is Tevin Tafese, and I'm a researcher at GIGA. And I will be chairing this session. So this is not my presentation. This is Mennatullah's, right? Yes, so let me kick us off with a brief introduction on the theme of this session. So this session will be on AI, development and connectivity. And I think many of you have raised that before. AI has vast potential to transform societies and key sectors in African economies, and through that drive economic development. For example, LLMs, large language models, have the potential to automate and augment vast swaths of knowledge work. Other types of AI, like predictive processing and analytics and computer vision, can maybe also reshape more traditional sectors in Africa, like agriculture and transportation. However, as many of you also raised earlier, there's also key gaps in data infrastructure and regulation when it comes to AI, and vast asymmetries in terms of the production and adoption of AI, and large power asymmetries. So as many of you know, most of the AI models are produced by some of the large tech companies that most of you will know, like OpenAI, Meta, Alphabet, and so forth. And one of the main reasons is that the enabling conditions of AI are often, or in part, somewhat deficient in Africa. So for example, when it comes to data, less than 1% of 1% of all the data used to train AI models is actually based on African languages. Infrastructure is partly lacking. So as you know, many of these new AI tools are based on computing power, so GPUs, which are very expensive. Regulation is another bottleneck. Some advancements have been made. There's now an African continental artificial intelligence strategy, but not much regulation has been passed on that front either. So what we'll do is to focus on selective aspects at the intersection of AI and development. I think according to the plan, kick us off, but Mennatullah, you can also start. I don't mind actually. But Bidisha will focus on digital public infrastructure in Africa, and as how it relates to digital inclusion and sovereignty on the continent. Letso will discuss linguistic diversity, NI, and digital exclusion, bias, and regulatory gaps. And then Mennatullah will reflect upon smart cities in the age of AI and the implications for equity and sustainability. And maybe a few more words on the logistics of the session. So each speaker will have 15 to 20 minutes for her presentation. And then maybe right after the presentation, we can just have quick questions to clarify maybe some points of the presentations. But we will have a longer discussion at the very end of the session, right? So let's spare like the deeper questions for the very end of the session. And I will ask all of the speakers then for the final discussion to come here and to sit here with me in the front. But without further ado, let's start with the first presentation. And I don't know, Mennatullah, if you would like to start, since your presentation is already on the screen. Looking forward to it.
Hi, everyone. It's weird, like strange to just kick off the presentations, first presentation in the day. I'm going to be reflecting on smart cities, as mentioned, but also more on what I mentioned in the morning about what I call as an intensified digital divide. It's actually a paper. It got published in Internet Policy Review. And this paper was based on my work on smart cities and urban AI in Africa, which I will show you at the first part of the presentation. How do I arrive here to this argument and kind of reflection? And in the end, I would like to open the discussion on how can we really move forward. So to give you a brief overview on my background, like building in how do I arrive here, I'm an interdisciplinary urban planner. I did my bachelor's in architecture engineering with a focus on urban planning and design. And then I moved to Germany to do my master's and PhD. In my master's, I worked mainly on urban policy, so the intersection of political science and urban planning. And then in my PhD, I focused more on digitalization and technology. I will reflect on this further. So I was mainly in a project, a third-party funded project, focusing on the intersection of urban studies and media studies. And then I moved to the US for my first postdoc, and I was hosted in a computer science department, so I became kind of more of a technical person. And during this time, I have an interesting story in relation to how my positionality changed from viewing myself as more like an activist and then moving further to be more like socio-technical engineer, since I found out that I am too critical also for kind of activism in the field. So I was also criticizing myself. So in my master's, I realized that connecting urban policymaking and implementation actually kind of requires kind of a political will, like it's a complete ecosystem that kind of needs to be present and existing to be able to connect what is said in policy with what's happening in reality and on the ground. This was like 10 years ago, yes. And I realize now that we are still in the same discussion, like we still speak about the disconnection, how to connect. I mean, as long as we speak about integration, then it's not really existing. And in my PhD, I focus more on how digitalization of urban development becomes a question of social and spatial justice. And I realized that actually, when we speak about social justice or spatial justice in Africa, I was focusing on Cairo, and I was more viewing it as a local yet global case study. And this also kind of relates to what was discussed in relation to majority-minority word, but I actually tried to stay away from this kind of divisions because I think it reinforces the binary thinking. So basically, I realized in this PhD that the injustice is actually a co-construction. So it's not only a kind of a Western input, and it's not only a state, even state or government construction, but rather even the people were part of constructing the injustice of using digital technologies and media representation, in my case, in regarding to urban development. Afterwards, I started to do different work related to, like, for example, the Charter of Ethics of Science and Technology in the Arab region. We also had a project at the Technical University of Berlin, and it was a project trying to link scholars from North and South Africa and bringing in viewpoints from what we situate in the literature as the Near South. And we started to look at how urban planning kind of relates also to like learning from the South and all of this kind of discourse. We also in 2020 got funding from Facebook Research as a grant to develop the Cairo Urban AI Charter, which relates directly to what I'm presenting about, what we call as smarter justice. And we wanted actually to bring in interdisciplinary experts and researchers to discuss how urban AI can be implemented in Africa for driving more like spatial and social justice in African cities. Based on that, we had a kind of a forward look on how justice can be looked at in urban planning and in smart cities. We basically were interested to see how most of the discussion on justice focus on social aspects or environmental aspects or even spatial aspects starting 2009 with the work of Edward Soya. And we were trying to say in the digital age and the mediatized age, we need to also include the technology in this aspects of justice. So in this paper and the paper that I submitted to Andrew, we were arguing for what we call as smart urban justice. So having kind of spatio-technical aspects, having environmental technical aspects, having socio-technical aspects, and embedding the technology when we discuss about justice and its aspects. We also, based on the Cairo Urban AI project or the Cairo Urban AI Charter, we had funding from EPFL in Switzerland to develop, I guess it's the first MOOC on urban AI in Africa. And it's an online course. It's actually available online. If you're interested to complete it, you can do it online. And most recently, what I mentioned in the morning that I'm working on in my habilitation at the Technical University of Munich, we're developing the AI multi-stakeholder platform for decision-making. And it's actually very interesting because as we develop it further, it's kind of an iterative process right now. We try to see how AI will act as different stakeholders, so not only about using AI to bring in the multi-stakeholders for the decision-making, but we try to see what if we ask LLMs, different LLMs, to even do discussions and conversations with one another, so what they will kind of reach. So now, so based on this like kind of background and like connecting the dots, I was reflecting on how generative AI and in this sense, like relate to social and like equity questions in general in Africa and beyond. And actually, this paper was kind of ignited from just a workshop we were discussing about possible like research topics for projects. And I realized that we have a lack of understanding with how, with the rise of generative AI, there are existing, like there is a widening digital divide. It's not only about prompt literacy, for example. Many discussions focus on, like you need to, for example, you can find many like prompt engineering courses online. And this kind of courses sometimes assume that as a learner, if you just learn how to prompt, then you are good to go and you kind of understand the technology. We find in the literature that there's like different waves, mainly two waves of digital divide. The first one was about physically accessing to computer or to internet and to technology. And then later on, over time, the focus shifted towards effective use of these technologies and maybe discussions on digital literacy. So it was about teaching like or building capacity for using like computer and so on. But we noticed that with the rise of AI and generative AI, we are witnessing a new layer of digital inequality, which I argue in that article focused on comprehension and control. So it's not just about accessibility, but rather about really understanding the logic behind like generative AI. So it's not only about prompt engineering. There is a bigger discussion in relation to how the data is created that needs to be understood. And in the end of the day, to be critical about the outputs of AI and to more use it as an assistant rather than as a replacer. But this is a whole other debate. So, so in this regard, I argue that there is an emerging new intensified digital divide with the use of generative AI. And this divide is rooted in AI literacy. So basically the ability to understand, critique, and be critical and about and interact with AI systems responsibly. And in that sense, generative AI literacy also relates to like have different like ethical implications, socioeconomic implications, and so on. I also reflect a bit on the compound impact of generative AI on society. So it's not like that this generative AI widens digital inequality across different sectors. So even in education, also in employment, even marginalized, for example, entrepreneurs face barriers like limited funding, poor internet, and lack of AI expertise, and how we need to look at not only like it's about comprehension, but also it's about how this lack of comprehension impacts the different sectors of society. So I thank you so much for listening, and I look forward to the discussion. Will I have questions?
We can have like a few questions standing maybe. There are some, and then we'll move to the next presentation and then have more discussion.
Thanks. So I was just curious in terms of like your position as an academic how you imagine digital capabilities landing with students. So it's something that I'm grappling with, and I'm sure many others are grappling with, is how as the entire global university sector grapples with AI and what that starts meaning for knowledge generation projects. What do you think are the kind of specific questions that need to be asked around digital capabilities in Africa? And this is possibly tangential to your presentation, but it also seems like very applied and practical as an output of what you're talking about. Are there ways in which we need to think differently about digital capabilities in quote-unquote Africa? Or do you think this is a kind of global conversation about changing ways of thinking? And I guess kind of any area that you want to comment on that as somebody doing research but also teaching in a knowledge context where increasingly the frameworks of knowledge, I mean, they've always been, well, the university system is built on external structures of knowledge being imposed onto African institutions of thought. How does AI land? There's a lot in that question. It's a bit clumsy, forgive me, but I'd be curious.
I can share with you my very personal point of view. So it's not really scientific. Maybe it needs to be investigated. So I taught actually in Egypt, in Germany, and in the US. I can say that in Egypt and Germany, somehow, or maybe in a better way to say it, in the US, the digital capabilities are much more advanced. In Germany, maybe it's more about how the critical thinking about using digital tools is more advanced and the ethical questions. And this is somehow in Egypt not present. So thinking about the ethical implications of this, but this is a bigger discussion, not only in relation to the use of digital tools in education, but it's a bigger discussion in relation to, for example, research, scientific research, and ethical research and research integrity and so on. So I think it's somehow, the use, for example, of AI can be an example or a phenomena in education that can be investigated to understand kind of wider scientific, sorry, that's my phone. So it's can be used to understand wider, you can just press anything. Yeah, thank you. So it can be understood as a phenomena or that kind of shows wider questions. It's not only about the use of digital skills only, but rather about competences in education and reflecting on competence-based education. You're welcome.
Yeah, so thank you very much for your presentation. So my question is on the widening digital divide. And as we may all know that the traditional digital divide that we know was between the haves and the haves not in terms of them owning a digital divide, a digital device, and also accessing the internet. But now that we have realized that we are getting maybe to 90 to even 100% access of the internet and digital devices for almost, all the, societies in the globe. My question would be, maybe it's something that you are still investigating as well. How, is this digital divide then happening in this era? How is it widening, given the fact that there's more access to digital devices and there's more access to internet connectivity? Yeah, thank you.
Yeah, thank you so much. Actually, this is very interesting. I agree with you, there is much more access, but at the same time, this accessibility is not always accompanied with a clear education or learning about how to use the technology. So to give you an example, I deal with a lot of research assistants, and I lead actually a research program in one of the German Berlin-based NGOs. It's called Impact Circles. And I noticed that when we have like different like research tasks, I realized that research assistants not always use AI. For example, with AI, do not always use it in the sense that it is an assistant to them, but rather sometimes it's used whether like you can see a lot of hallucinations. Maybe you can see even citations. I think every one of us here like experienced this. And this is somehow very concerning for me personally, and especially with regard to the next generations, because for me, the use of AI started after I finished my PhD. So somehow I could understand how to do research and then how to use AI to assist in doing research. I'm not sure how this will affect the next generations. In my PhD, we were focusing on a media theory. It's called mediatization theory. It's developed by Andreas Happ, who is a German media scholar. And it speaks about how society changes with the use of technology and media. So for example, first with the introduction of printing, and then with the introduction of TV, and then mobile phones, and then the internet, now with the AI and virtual reality. So it's kind of, I don't understand, honestly, it's a bigger question. I don't understand how the current generation, especially even the younger ones, like I have a small 1.5-year boy, I don't know when he starts using digital technology and AI like as a part of his everyday life and even for doing his school assignments. I'm not really sure to what extent he really got the content itself or not. So I think it's a bigger question. I'm not sure if people in education technology fields get into this or not, but thank you for raising the question.
Thank you for the presentation. So my question is a bit out of the way, I think. So a couple of papers have come out in recent months or weeks claiming that the use of AI is making us more stupid. So my question would be, if that's the case, do you think we really need to worry about this widening gap, if that gap means the gap between being stupid and being smart?
Actually, I'm not sure I agree with this perspective. Again, it kind of relates with how a person uses AI. And I think it also relates to generational question. So is it like our generation or is it the younger generation? For the younger generation, maybe, I'm not sure. But for us, I think it's about how, I forgot what I wanted to say. So it's not really about making us stupid, but maybe reducing our specific skills abilities. So for example, in relation to writing, I was speaking with someone who is saying, okay, AI helped me to have better like writing output, but at the same time, it made me not work on my writing skills, which is true. But this is in one aspect can be considered like you're being stupid in this skill, but at the same time, you had more like mind capacity to maybe focus more on the content. Maybe you don't even need to learn how to really write efficiently. It's not what you really need to learn as, for example, maybe someone in an engineering, a very technical field. So you kind of, theoretically, you have more time and more mind capacity to focus more on the technical output. And personally, I think this happened with me on a personal level, since I started to use AI in my work like around 1.5 years, just because I was giving birth, so I didn't have time. So I decided to use AI, and it was very helpful. So yeah, like in some skills would be kind of more advanced, and other skills would be kind of like go backward. But I think it's in the end the compound impact would be it's not that humans become more stupid. That's my personal perspective. Yeah. Thank you so much for your question.
this for? Who the fuck is this for? Nobody? Okay.
I'm not even doing a presentation, I'll just be referring to my notes. Okay, really? Yeah, if you can. Yeah. Good morning. So the reason why I went to audience and asked her what is her name is because I also started criticizing my presentation. And the reason why I'm criticizing it is because it does have an element of data colonization. And when you were speaking, I was like, but now I think as Africans, we do have, even though we have limited resources, but we do have the agency and the ability to build our own data sets and train our own large language models, right? So and I'm like, oh, is my presentation even still worth it? And because now the title is Preserving African Linguistic Diversity in AI and Addressing Digital Exclusions. So on the project that I'm working on as a research fellow at UP, which is to develop a playbook for illustrating best practices for African languages, digitizing African languages. So we started doing data collection, and when the data came, I realized that us at UP, we are the colonizers. Because we had a survey, and we asked people to tell us where they're from, what languages do they work in, what are their roles, right? So when we were analyzing data, me and my assistant, we were cleaning the data. We claimed that we were cleaning the data, and we started saying, oh, some people, they say, in South Africa, we say isiNdebele, but in Zimbabwe, they say Ndebele, right? So now, are we going to force people in Zimbabwe to identify as isiNdebele because us who have money say isiNdebele? You get the point? So now, criticizing my paper, I'm like, then where does linguistic diversity stand in the case where if I have research funds and I'm doing a project and I'm going to say, because I don't want my data visualization to be confused, I'm going to call this language isiNdebele. And I'm not representing other people, but we are the same people who said, guys, let us bring Africa together and let's speak about this. What are you doing to actually preserve African languages? And the other interesting thing that happened when we were doing the data was, I was saying to my assistant, I think we should really, in cleaning the data, let us not miss the point of seeing what the data is telling us, because English is not our first language, and now maybe someone wants to say something, and we start judging them to say, no, but this is not how you should say it, then what do those best practices of digitizing African languages mean, So those are the reflections I just had, and thank you so much for triggering me into that. My presentation is not really going to be long, so now I'm dreadful to do my presentation because of these reflections, very important reflections. So yeah, as artificial intelligence becomes central to how we communicate, govern and produce language, so how, amidst this, I feel and I notice that African languages remain largely underrepresented. So you see now I feel like I'm contradicting my statements. So this presentation explores how digital exclusion and algorithmic bias and regulatory gaps continue to marginalize African linguistic communities in AI development. And it explores the ethical dimensions of data sets, collection, and lack of policy frameworks that protect African digital sovereignty. So drawing on African-led projects like Masakani, Data Science for Social Impacts, I want to argue that without community-driven data practices and equitable regulation, AI will continue the African linguistic erasure. So this presentation proposes strategies to center African languages and knowledge system in global AI ecosystem. The question I have is why this matters. I feel like AI is no longer a distant frontier, but it shapes how we communicate, govern, generate knowledge, and teach. So, but African languages, despite being some of the most spoken and diverse globally, remain invisible in the AI systems. So the question is this absence technical? Is it a technical oversight, or is it a form of colonial legacies, extractive data practices, and global AI ecosystem that centers high-resource Western languages? So the other thing that I notice a lot when I read papers or when we speak with different colleagues, you hear that they say, oh, African languages are technically low-resource languages for the virtue of being African languages. And I wonder where that places us as Africans. So these exclusions means not only fewer tools in African languages, it also means African worldwide views and epistemologies are left out of the digital futures. So, framing the problem, the paper uses data colonialism to describe African linguistic data is often collected without consent, used without benefits to the communities it came from, governed by global tech. The other question we asked our colleagues was, what is actually the benefit? How do we define a benefit when we're taking consent from communities? And we still really haven't gotten the answer of what is the benefit of data collection. So this work is grounded in decolonial theory, and it helps us to identify how AI systems reproduce colonial structures in new forms, and also it's grounded in digital justice, focusing not just on access, but fairness, agency, and representation. So, yeah, I feel like we should not just see African communities as data sources, but see them as active collaborators in the field. So, because African languages are underrepresented in AI due to systematic underinvestment, infrastructural gaps. Yeah, so how do we enable African communities to actually work within the AI systems? And yeah, in conclusion, I would just like to say the marginalization of African languages in AI is not inevitable. It's a consequence of whose knowledge is centered, whose languages are resourced, and whose voices are heard. And now that I'm thinking a lot of things at the same time, I'm thinking of my PhD study, which was in African languages, and there it was grounded in discourse theory from Michael Foucault. And he questions who gets to say what, who has the power to actually inform knowledge. And I'm just thinking about that now, and I just want to say, let us build AI systems that do not erase African languages. And what do I mean by erase is because we argue a lot with my colleagues about making African languages computational, but not really representing what is being an African. And we are seeing it by what I just said about isiNdebele and Ndebele, because it will make computational sense to say it's isiNdebele and exclude others in the process. Hence, I'm glad that in my project, I'm now starting to see where does the marginalization stem from. And now it's an African person marginalizing another African person. And I guess it gets complicated there. So yeah, I would just like to end it there. Thank you. Don't ask me difficult questions, please.
Thank you very much. I hope this is not difficult.
Yeah.
Yes, the issue about your project, the fact that within African languages, there's a difficulty in representation. can we see it as a default status for any process of legibility making? Okay, any process that is meant to see through, to automate, would definitely mean that some level of detail is lost. Okay. For example, many of the AI tools that are developed are from places that are more homogeneous than Africa in terms of language. There's a high linguistic diversity in Africa. If you take English in Europe, it's widely spoken, right? Take Nigeria, for example, and see languages that are there. So I think that whole idea of AI development, one need to generate from Africa with the African thought. That way, it is developed to contain or to accommodate that diversity. But if you have any Western mindset of having a one standard to do it, then it becomes problematic fitting in the African context. So let's not look at it as problematic, perhaps, but it fits a certain context. How do we get one that fits the African context?
Yeah.
Okay.
Ooh, okay, I'll just give a comment, since I didn't get the question mark in what you're saying. But we were speaking about meeting language where it is in relation to the fact that languages are continuously evolving. Mm-hmm. And someone from Limpopo might not say something the same as someone from Mpumalanga. So how do we then make a representation? So it's better not to standardize the language and to meet it where it is. And if in this place and time we are where we have different variants of African languages, so let's build with that approach. Yeah.
Okay, so mine are more of contributions, and I just wanted to comment on the sort of critiquing oneself. You know, I feel that is progressive. Like when you're critiquing yourself, right now it made you think and think and think. And hopefully you'll get some of the answers from the different presenters here, from what you're asking. And he just took the words, he literally took the words, my comment out of my mouth, about the issue of homogenization of African languages. The problem is that when you're talking about the West, they have more like the same cultures and languages. And, you know, our languages are informed by our cultures. And so even if we're talk about South African languages, there are more than 11 local languages. And that is so difficult. So at the end of the day, you find that it becomes difficult to come up with, you know, unless there's a whole lot of funding. And during my research, I realized that, you know, there's funding for African research. But what is African research? You know? And then about what you were saying about isiNdebele and Ndebele, I feel like sometimes as researchers, when we go into communities, we already have our perspective. And then, you know, we try and make those people fit into that perspective that we already have as researchers, more than getting what the community has to say. Those are my comments.
Oh, thank you so much. Okay, I think we're going to have another conversation, right? Yeah, but... Did you have another question? Yeah. Okay. Specifically related to... Yes. Okay, then just go ahead and then we will have remaining questions. Cool.
Thank you. My question is critical of your paper in the sense that, don't you think as Africans, we should accept the fact that because of colonialism, there's a sense of homogeneity in our languages, such that in many parts of Africa, people speak English, French, Portuguese, for example, as 3 languages. And therefore, shouldn't we then accept that because Africans can communicate in this and Arabic, so 4, English, French, Portuguese, and Arabic, so that then, instead of focusing on the diversity of languages, which we may not never overcome because there are too many, then focus on context, which is agreeing to make our AI data sets in these common languages, but then specific to contexts, like different sectors and different environments in Africa, instead of focusing on the languages? Thank you.
Ooh. Okay, I'm not sure now because there's a question, and I'm gonna forget them. Yeah. Okay, please.
But we can also open it up to all of you, right? So just a quick reaction.
Okay, so just a very quick reaction. I think there's a link between language and intelligence. And to push with this argument that we should accept imposed languages, that would have an impact, serious impact on education, especially for young people. So that's just really a quick response to that suggestion.
I just wanted to say I disagree, because we work so hard in African language research, we work so hard for representation, and now to just come and say we are contextualizing our work, I think that might be a little bit limiting. Yeah. Thank you. Oh God, I forgot your question. Yeah.
Is there room for another question? Oh, no.
Let's have the final presentation and we open it up. Then
Not to her, but I think just to ask.
yeah, we can raise it like in the final discussion. Would you like to come to that?
Also just spot problem? No, I haven't. Okay. Is it this one?
People are getting shorter, yes. All right, so unfortunately my talk is nothing to do with AI, so disappointing I know, but we'll hopefully come back in the Q&A. So I am going to talk about something called digital public infrastructure. I'll explain in a bit what do I mean by that. But just a bit of background and justify me being here, because I'm not an expert on any of the African context. So that's why I feel the need to justify that why I'm here. So I'm trained in sociology and political science, and I have been working on digitalization of public services and its impact on state-citizen relationship for over a decade. My main focus has been this digitalization in India. And for last 10 years, I have been working on the biometric ID project in India, which many of you might already know. It's called Aadhaar, and how it has kind of transformed the state-citizen relationship, welfare delivery in India. And that's what my connection to DPI, because now this biometric ID system has become this base on which this idea of digital public infrastructure has been conceptualized and then advocated in many parts of the world. And one of the things that bring me here is that as I kept working on digital public infrastructure in India, we realized that there is now, because it has become, like India has become this poster child of that we can do it at a scale, create this kind of software infrastructure. India has become in the front runner of advocating and pushing or even promoting and implementing this across many of the global South countries, and the African context being one of the very potent field of that. And that's what my connection, so this is my justification. And what I'm going to talk about today is very preliminary findings from we just started to look at it this year. So we look at people who develop and deploy digital public infrastructures in India, and then how these group of people, what is this network that then brings it to the African context. And I'm going to draw on some of the preliminary interviews and data from Mozambique and Malawi. And they may not use the word DPI as such at times, but it's overall digitalization of public services that we are looking at. So with that, and this is the work that I'm doing with two of my colleagues, Nafis Hassan and in University of Amsterdam, and Tanya Hendricks in University of Leuven. How do I go? Yeah. So I'm just going to quickly talk about the legacy of the DPI, which is the India Stack model. I will not get too much into the technical part. I would rather focus on the role of the state in pushing this model. And what it takes from starting from thinking about software to make that into an infrastructure, where is the role of the state in doing that? Oh, how can I not go? Yeah. No, this is not what I want. What am I doing? Okay. Yeah. So this is what a DPI technical infrastructure looks like. So you start with a population register which is digitized, or a digital data of the entire population, and on that base infrastructure you built on other kind of services like payment services or data services and contract. So it just keeps building on. That's why it's also called stack. So you create one stack on top of the other. It's kind of a layered infrastructure. And what is the USP of this infrastructure? They're based on open source software. So the software codes are available usually on GitHub so that anybody can have access to the source code. And they are created with an API kind of model. So they're interoperable platforms so that they can easily, one stack can connect to the other stack very easily. And of course, they're built for scale. So I think scalability is something which may be what AI and DPI can sort of share. Okay. Yeah. So this is again just repeating what I said. This is the India Stack model, which has already been implemented in India, which is the ID infrastructure. Then above the ID infrastructure, there is a payment infrastructure, and then we are building a data infrastructure or data exchange infrastructure on top of that. But in India, there are also conversations about documentations, contracts, which are all going to be on these stackable platforms. Just a disclaimer before I move on to the African context, that these are not without controversies even in India. Aadhaar itself has been sort of engulfed in a lot of controversies in India, but despite of these controversies, it has become more or less a stable infrastructure now. A lot of it has to do with the top-down policy mandate of the state. And why is this an important piece of information? Because then now this is the model which is going to be implemented elsewhere as well, wherever it goes. So that's where we envisage that the state will have to play an important role if they have to become a stable infrastructure otherwise. Yeah. So in the 2023 G20, India had the chairmanship of the G20 summit, and that's where this term digital public infrastructure really became a consolidated term to explain some of these stackable infrastructure, software infrastructures that we were building. And this also became a way of, in theorization, we can think of some scholars have called it a boundary object. In STIAS, this is something, especially in STIAS studies of infrastructure, boundary object is used as this term, which then can be interpreted by different communities in different ways, but they then become, on the fence to communicate across boundaries or across communities. So DPI has become that language which is now then being used by different, whether you are a developer, whether you are a policy advocate, whether you're a state bureaucracy. So DPI is sort of being pushed as this new language of software infrastructure building. And they're mostly relying on this idea of a digital public good, which is taking on liberal economic model of public good, which are open source software, and which are non-excludable and non-rivalrous. So the source code is what is the public good, and what now the role of the state is going to be in making this into an infrastructure. So there are two things that I want to highlight before in this paper, which is a work in progress, that how is this different from the old technology transfer model that African countries have seen before. So one thing that the funding and the way the technology transfer is going to happen is kind of reconfigured here. How is this, this is what you see as a protocol based. So rather than saying that, the one size fit all model of this is the technology that we use, and so others should use it, what you're saying that this is our source code, this is what we have done, or this is the basis on which we have done. So now you take it and figure it out how to do it in your country, right? So your context matters, so you pick this up and figure out. But what I want to highlight here, the main actors in this protocol space. So who are the people or who are the institutions which are defining the standards here? So what is the standards that one needs to follow so that there is there is some sort of universal language in which we think about this software. And you see a lot of the old suspects, like usual suspects, the UN and other ones, but you also see a very, very strong presence of private philanthropy here, like Gates Foundation, Omidyar, who are now not just funding this project, but also are in the space which are going to define the standards by which some of these software's infrastructures are going to be built. And I don't know if it's very visible here. So there is this Digital Public Good Alliance, which is endorsed and initiated by UN. But India and specifically Indian software industry is has a very strong presence in this alliance. So they actually play a very important role in setting the standards of the protocols, the open protocols on which these infrastructures are going to be built. And another important part of this funding infrastructure, which is different from the old technology transfer model, is that it's no longer a direct aid to the government of sorts. So most of the non-profit organizations from India and from other places are then funded by this network of funders, the private philanthropy or the UN model, or other bilateral organization. They then come and implement this with this funding in many African countries as a hand-holding process. So it's not a direct aid from international organizations to the government, African governments. So that's the shift that we see. Let me see if I can quickly go. Yeah. No.
Is
there a question? Sorry? No. No, I'm struggling with the slide shift, I think. It's not moving when I'm clicking on it. Yeah. So this is, so one of the ways in which the India's software industry's role is kind of implemented or implicated here is that it's a decolonial perspective that is promoted, that it's India being a post-colonial country itself. We share the same experience of colonization, so we understand the context of colonization, and our state and bureaucracy also reflect some of the similar issues and challenges, and hence India is a better placed. So we will see how, to what extent, oh God, sorry about this. I don't know how to change the slide. Yeah, so this is a quote from one of the policy experts in India who advocates DPI in Africa and other global south countries. So we have a market in other global south countries because they have a similar histories and backgrounds in governance and welfare. So that's the packaging of decoloniality here that you see. I hope I can go to the next slide smoothly. Yeah, so this is from a consultant from India who's advocating DPIs in many African countries. So they said government will adopt this code, configure it, customize it, and deploy it. So a public good is now going, so the governments in many African countries, they not only will look for where it should be implemented, but what should be the legal infrastructure, what is going to be the regulatory environment in which this software will be implemented. So these are then the role of the state. So this is what is expected. I'll just read it out because I don't know if you can read it from far away. DPI is all about setting up the right institutions, setting up the right frameworks, and ensuring you have got policies in place. Now, if you don't do all that, you run into a range of issues, both from the point of view of lack of ownership at a country level, as well as pushback from civil society, from other actors who see this as like a technological takeover. So when you say you need to do capacity building, it goes back to the original point I was making, which is governments need to know what is the problem they want to solve. They need to be able to frame that well. They need to be able to frame it in a way that it is not the use of technology is not a point solution, but it's an evolving capacity. So I just want to focus on this quote a bit because this is what summarizes what is expected out of the state in many of these African countries, including where we did our study in Mozambique and Malawi. So there's a lot of expectations. So you were expecting state bureaucracy to understand not only the technical complexities of these systems and be able to deal and have the capacities within the bureaucracy to deal with this and figure out how problem can be solved in their own countries, but you're also expecting states, am I running out of time? You're also expecting state to come up with the right policy, regulatory, and legal framework all at the same time to support, not only the adoption of this system, but also kind of resist pushback from civil society organizations so that privacy laws are not violated, so there is no whistleblowing is happening. So all of that is something that needs to be in place. But unfortunately, what are, what did I do? Oh, God. Wait. I'm almost there. Yeah. Okay. So this is my last slide, so thankfully no more glitches. But unfortunately, what we see that there is not only many of you already talked about digital divide in many of the contexts. So we are talking about contexts where there is no digitalization. We are talking about, forget about digitalization, there is existing infrastructures are not equipped enough. There is lack of electricity. There's lack of data. Or even if there is data, who owns this data? What's the quality of this data? So many of the African states are already struggling with the datafication and demands of datafication of bureaucracy. So when there is this holistic expectations from the state, what we see happening that there is this fragmented nature of this implementation, which is kind of like, repeating the cycle of aid-based technology transfer model that we have seen. Even though the transfer or the mechanisms of this technology transfer has changed, what we see as an outcome is more or less kind of repeating what we have seen before. So this is a quote from one of the consultants who is expected to develop a disaster data framework. It is supposed to be a collaboration, but with this one, they just come and ask us to do this, build it, and come and bring it. These are 100 lines of codes. It's a source code, here you go. It doesn't work like that. So even if you make this this open software-based available, and which is quote-unquote free in a way, and you are supposed to just, so you know, how it is sort of projected that this is a freely available public good that is being made available to the state, and it is the state's responsibility to now make this work. But what we see that there is a lack of capacity, not just technical capacity that we are talking about, but also institutional capacity, which we have seen maybe the same criticism that we have seen in 80s when we were talking about structural adjustment programs. But at the same time, the cycle of the dependency on external expertise to continue to develop this within Africa and for Africa, that cycle is not broken. That cycle kind of repeats here. So I'll just end with that, and hopefully we'll have more discussion. Thanks.
Thank you very much. So I've jumped the queue with your permission. Great presentation, thank you. I just have one question. You alluded to it, but perhaps I need some more detail if that is available. What are some of the more specific post-colonial imperatives for India leading the DPI, the global DPI discourse, especially in relation to African countries? Thank you.
Yeah, of course, I could not detail all those, the lack of time, but it's in the paper, so I hope you can have access to the paper. So one of the ways I think it is justified is that India cracked the biometric ID project, and which is 1.4 billion people, right? So that kind of gave them this confidence, or how do you say, like, quote-unquote success in a way to building this infrastructure with a lot of state support. I think that kind of set the tone for, in a way, to say that these are infrastructures we can build at scale, and even in a country which is not from the global north. I think that was a starting point. But what you also see, what I'm trying to argue in the paper, there are a lot of backdoor policy conversations that happen here, right? So who knows who? And that has happened within India, and this who knows who is also now happening outside India. And that is what we are trying to unravel with this, mapping the network of something like a digital public good alliance. So who is part of this network? Who are the people who are making these standards? Is again that, like, why India question. I don't know if that answers your question.
I get the why India.
Yeah.
Why they are leading the global discourse is very clear.
Yeah.
They have done it at large scale, under-resourced country, but you just inserted a post-colonial dimension to that, perhaps to give African countries or other countries that are trying to adopt that model as being pushed globally to give them to the platform to be more at ease to let India lead this. So I wanted to understand in more specific terms from that post-colonial dimension, what exactly are the specifics? Why should I, as an African country, be more at ease as against maybe the global not leading it in prior kinds of technology, AI and all? But for India, it's my brother, post-colonial. What are some of the specific dimensions? Why should we be more at ease?
I don't think that I'm trying to say that you should be at ease at all. What I'm trying to say that actually post-colonial is no longer the in-word. Decolonial is the in-word these days. So this is exactly how in the policy documents it's framed, that it is a decolonial perspective. And one of the things, in one of the specific ways it is being said to be decolonial, that these public infrastructures are supposed to be built within the domestic capabilities. And one of the things that they underline in the policy document, that this is a resistance towards the onslaught of big tech. That means that you are creating your own data, you're creating, making these infrastructures available to your own public. But again, like the more you get into the socio-technical details of it, you realize that to what extent, even within India, to what extent even that is possible, because we all rely on a cloud infrastructure which is completely controlled by the big tech. So irrespective of how big and how scalable an infrastructure you build, to what extent we can really decolonize our current digital infrastructures, whether public or not, is of course questionable. But the decoloniality, it definitely comes from India's past, and that is what is projected in policy document as a justification to push India's role in it. Yep.
Yes. And then after we also have one, we still have one question from Chris, the online audience. So,
thank you very much. I'd like to ask the first and the third speakers my question, not that it doesn't apply to the second speaker. You focused on the ways in which, let me call it generative AI, is being introduced, is being applied, is being used in African smart cities and in terms of digital political infrastructure. Through doing this, it not only creates new jobs, but through automation, it destroys a number of jobs. In terms of planners, presumably in Cairo, in terms of a whole number of civil servants at different levels in India. That's the first comment I want to make. In other words, it is not all necessarily going to be good for everyone. And the question I have, which I come back to, is what about those people who are going to suffer in some way regarding the implementation of this generative AI? Just one comment. With regard to South Africa, I have gone to look at the Future of Jobs Report 2025 of the World Economic Forum. This is about South Africa. It lists the jobs being created and the jobs being lost. And the jobs being created are digitally and specialized, skill-oriented. The jobs being lost are white-collar in our banks. That's South African banks. They are blue-collar in some of our agriculture. In other words, there are jobs being lost, according to this report, as well as jobs being created. My question is, not that I'm certainly not against the two proposals you've made, including the fact that it's going to address the colonial issue, which is going to remain with us. But my question is, in terms of those implementing it, has any attention whatsoever been given to the poorer, the less skilled, the more rural, who are going to lose their jobs as this is implemented? Or is that not part of the analysis? Thank you.
So that was a broad question. So what, like, I don't know, you spoke mostly about AI, you spoke about generative AI, right? So who wants to take that question? Like the labor markets, because you also touched upon them. I think Mennatullah, it also referenced to you a bit, so to your presentation. Would you like to take it?
Yeah, I will try because it's a hard question. Actually, I totally agree with you that, of course, there are like jobs created, jobs kind of disappearing. And it's somehow similar to what happened during automation, like early automation. So I think societies need to kind of at least learn something from that process and try to implement it again, whether through maybe capacity building, maybe more education, more understanding. I'm not sure the extent to which the disappearing of those jobs, like what do people do when their job disappears? I mean, they need to work and they need to like raise money. So I think anyway there will be a way out of this kind of crisis for them. This is very theoretical, of course, and of course the more a person is kind of poor or not having maybe access to digital education, the harder for them to kind of get into this ecosystem. But at the same time, there will still remain especially, for example, in Africa and also in Germany, because of for example, the fear of AI, there will still be manual jobs that they can enter the market to. But practically how this will be implemented, I'm not sure. You also raised a very interesting point, whether those who implement AI are aware of the impact or the consequences. Actually, I'm not sure. I also didn't read a lot in this discourse, but I would assume that they actually don't. They don't consider or even think about them, especially because I worked a lot with computer scientists, and I noticed that. I mean, this is a bit judgmental, but I noticed that most coming from computer science discipline are not really that critical or that thinking about society at large or the impact of what they're doing. What I noticed that they mostly work on, it's a very technical job, even unlike engineering, who are kind of more problem solvers. But rather, from my experience working with computer scientists, that I noticed that you give them a very specific task that they need to do maybe or develop a code for, but they don't think about what this will be used for. But definitely more research is needed in that regard. And now with the more kind of wave or turn to interdisciplinary teams, I guess there started to be that, for example, very technical computer scientists, they started to at least know that these discussions exist, because I assume that those working in completely technical teams, they wouldn't actually think about those questions.
Perfect. And I know I'm not a panelist, but as an economist, I feel that I have to comment on that question as well, if I may, just for a second. And because there's actually quite a few economists that think about the labor market impacts of newly introduced innovations, like Darren Acemoglu, like the author of the book that you have there, or David Autor. And so there's not only automation, but there's also augmentation, and I think that's also what you referenced, right? So each newly introduced innovation automates certain jobs, or rather tasks of specific jobs, but it also augments and introduces new tasks, right? So in my opinion, it's unclear at the moment what the overall impact of generative AI and other AI tools will be. So I think there's some occupations where most or many of the tasks will be automated, but I think there's also many occupations that will be augmented by generative AI. So, and I think there's very interesting research, economics research going on at the moment that looks into that and the impact on specific occupations. I just wanted to highlight that. And so now we have 10 more minutes or so, and I promised that we will first have Chris, online audience, because he raised his hand for a long time. And then I also saw you, and then we continue here. But let's take Chris first.
Okay, thank you so much. On Bidisha's presentation, I'm quite impressed by what India has achieved in as far as digital infrastructure. So in practice, I've worked with various people from India, and there's some good work that's been done in places such as the digital signature infrastructure and Aadhaar. And the use of open source for me is something that comes out very strongly. And I think in South Africa, there's a lot that we can learn from that. So in South Africa, we've got a state institution called SITA. It's mandated to provide IT services to the public sector. So some 20 years ago, there was some interest in getting on board in terms of putting in some strong digital infrastructure using open source. But over the years, this institution has seen a lot of challenges, mainly governance issues, so CEOs that change. And I think to a larger degree, challenges with just bread and butter issues like networking and all of that. So I'm interested to know, what is it that India is getting right? I mean, you've got a country of over 1.4 billion people. we are a much smaller country, but we're definitely not getting this right. And maybe some notes as well. You might know that we've got much more limited tech skills, even worse when it comes to contributions to open source. And we are heavily reliant on proprietary software such as Microsoft, Oracle, SAP. So I'm just interested to know what are your thoughts around that. Thanks.
Yeah, I can build up on this question, but first I want to talk about the question of how to correct and control AI. I mean, you talked about hallucinations, but the question, where do you get this second opinion about reliable sources which can probably correct it? So I'm not so techno-optimistic. I say we still have to have an ordinary education to have the knowledge how you can know what is a good or what is a bad result, what is hallucination. So there is still need for research and for scientific research, proper one. Or is there any other option? I don't see it. But coming back to the DPI, I mean, we in Germany, we also feel colonized, by the way, by the big tech concerns. And we try to build up in Europe, we try to build up platforms which are even cloud systems which are regional at least. And it's not so easy. But the question for Africa is, and that's the question, there is an article in Mail and Guardian just now, 2,000 different languages in Africa, or even more. I mean, we have in Germany, we also have more than one, most probably, if you go to some rural areas and Bavaria. But the thing is, how can you build this up, and how can you build up large language models when a lot of, especially poorer people, when it's not written, when it's not text? And that is, for me, the very big problem. And when there is a very strong, traditionally vocal and oral tradition, not only in Africa, but also in other parts of the world.
Let's collect, and then we'll have one final round of answers.
Okay, so mine is more of, I'm worried about this tax system. Maybe because I really don't understand technology. But I feel like, does it not build on prejudices and bias, like this tax system? For example, if you're going to be having someone's ID and you also have their bank information, does that not prejudice people, for example, from getting a loan? And also, can it not be used by, you talk about it being probably coming to African countries as well. Will it not be used by African governments as for political reasons, to quash repression, you know, that kind of thing? That's my worry with this, and I don't know. Yeah.
Perfect. Yeah, I don't see any more questions, so let's have a final round of responses. Maybe we'll start with you.
Yeah, okay.
Question here.
Yeah, so Chris, to your question, you know, I don't know if I can even say that how India got it right, because I'm also very critical of what we did not get right about the DPIs in India, because I mostly work on welfare and how welfare delivery has changed, and we do see a lot of exclusion when we digitize. And so when you think of a stable infrastructure, I mean, it is a stable infrastructure in the sense that it works at an operational bureaucratic level, but I do not mean to call it a stable infrastructure where there are no glitches, where there are no exclusion, or there are no discrimination. So I think I just want to make that very clear at the outset. And I also think why it works, because it worked in India, like to even build that scale was, in my opinion, or that's what I argue in most of my work, that there has been a very, very strong role of the state and its policies. So, for example, the biometric ID was mandated for any welfare services. that mean that if you did not have a biometric ID which works, you could not get any services, welfare services from the state. So that is kind of a very top-down policy approach to get the ball rolling to begin with. So, and there are of course repercussions of it at the ground level, so I'll not get into that, but I think for me that what India did right, if I even can call it right, is that a very, very strong top-down policy mandate. And now coming to your question of, you can see where I'm going with this, right? And in India, exactly those conversations, I mean, as I said during my presentation, that it has been a very controversial project. There had been lots of litigation in the court, which led to the privacy being recognized by the Supreme Court of India as a fundamental right of the citizen. But a lot of it happened afterwards. So you first introduce, then the litigation happens, and then you know how litigation works. So one of the very striking thing to address, it's not an answer to your worry, but maybe you will worry more, now, is that many of these advocacy groups, which the network that I'm talking about, like of the usual suspects and the new suspects, of these groups which are promoting this, is also that they want to take a depoliticized stand, right? They want to leave it that this is just a software infrastructures, or this is just an open source software that we are giving you for as a public good. What you do with it is none of our concern. So we leave it to you between your state and citizen. So if the citizen wants a democratic government, if the citizens want a government which is more privacy oriented, that is between them. We promote privacy as a philosophy, or we promote openness as a philosophy of software infrastructure development, but we do not interfere. So that has been the stance. So it's pretty much then, it's a very old school depoliticized stand of technology. Like we think of technology as just a neutral tool, and then we leave it to the society how they want to make use of it. And we don't get into those, right? So that's, that kind of distancing yourself from the political conversation or the more difficult conversations around it is what we see. Yep.
Lisa, would you like to react to the comment on the languages, like that many of the African languages are not written down, which is why it may be difficult to train these AI models?
I actually had a question for her. For her at that time, but I did not ask because there was lack of time. Yeah, which is building on to what you just said, because a lot of this Latin American languages are also in the similar position, that not just that these languages are not, they don't have a certain script, or are not structured in other maybe European languages, but also the fact that they do not have as strong a digital presence as the global north languages, and or other more prominent languages in the world. And AI is built on something being digitally present, right? So how is that going to exacerbate the digital divide in terms of language is something that I was curious.
Thank you. That is a complex question. All of them are complex, but I just want to start from intention, and also the fact that the beauty of digital justice is that it allows everyone to represent themselves. And perhaps it can start with what is your intention with your language. I understand that that can sound vague, given that some people don't really have access and infrastructure to build, but start from where you are, start with what you have. And I think, if I speak Sepedi, it's clear that I'm gonna start with my language, unfortunately. So I'm gonna give an example with Africans in South Africa. There's been a lot of investment in Africans, in building African source. like the African-speaking people have made an intentional decision to invest in their language. So I think we can learn best practice instead of saying, I mean, there's no one who's gonna come and build data sets for African languages. So perhaps we can draw from best practices as those who have done it, how did they do it, and to what extent did they do it? What can we learn from what we have? And yeah, start from there. Yeah.
Okay, perfect. Yeah. It was a great note to end. Do you want to react to the education? Right?
Not the education. I think the question was about if like there is a kind of an maybe it's education, education about how to correct AI, right? It was about this. I think there are two sides for this. One side is related to more like human-computer interaction discussions, which speak about the concept of the human in the loop, and they started to discuss like how AI systems need, like at some points, humans to enter in the AI system loop to be able to really kind of to have a human oversight. And more from the non-technical like disciplines, there is also a discussion on, actually this discussion, it's not really existing, but we are trying to build an ERC proposal which focuses exactly on this, on what is the ethics of delegating a decision to AI or not, like when to do it and when not to do it. We're using the case of urban planning and architecture design, and with the use of AI, whether like at which point should AI stop being part of the planning process or of the design process. So we're trying to build on this previous work on like human in the loop and so on, but to kind of contextualize it into more practical ways, like how to really move forward and what AI should do, what AI maybe should not do. There is a lot of discussion in AI ethics on like transparency, trust, and accountability, and so on. But there is still no discussion on what AI should not do.
Perfect. Okay. Wow. Okay, everybody's awake now. Okay, let's send a round of applause to the speakers. And move to the next session. Thank you. Wow, that was a round of explosion, yeah.
I share from my side. Sorry.
Thank you very much, Elena. And good afternoon. I think we've quickly jumped to past noon now. So my presentation is titled Multipolar Digital Cooperation. It's a position paper assessing Africa's digital sovereignty in an increasingly fragmented digital sphere. What does that mean for Africa? What should we be doing from a continental positionality, given the current emerging dynamics as we keep getting more and more disconnected on the social fabric, interconnected more on the technological dimension, if you look at it from an STIAS position, and with the continuous changes with the globalization order, what kind of perspectives should Africa be having, given what is happening from other regions as well with respect to digital sovereignty in these, as the digital footprints continue to expand across the globe? And what does this mean for Africa? And so my agenda is simple, just some background introduction around some of the emerging contexts globally. And then I will zoom in on what is the crux of my presentation with respect to the continent in relation to the policy tensions and emerging alignments in relation to digital sovereignty, the digital sovereignty discourse. And then I'll end with some policy recommendations as a positional statement with respect to some of the issues I'll raise, and then we can have a discussion around that. And so for me, when I look at the issue around sovereignty as it's beginning to emerge across the globe, the key issue is about maintaining the independence of contests, countries within their own borders. And as the digital landscape continues to evolve, beyond even the physical borders now, as the digital footprints continue to expand, what does that mean as we continue to get more interconnected technology? What are the imperatives for nations to still be able to control their own digital infrastructure and the data with respect to their own citizens? Who owns those data? How can they control whatever effects or outcomes that can proliferate as this data keeps on getting dismembered across the emerging global digital infrastructure? What are the imperatives for maintaining the sovereignty of countries within these dynamics from a networking perspective beyond the mere geographical borders? How does this emerging technological landscape impact the state's independence with respect to their domestic and foreign policy, as it affects their own citizens, and of course, ultimately, what will it mean for their own economy with respect to the local businesses that are playing in these emerging ecosystems. At the end of the day, the bottom line with regards to these discourses, based on what kinds of positions countries are taking, are either with respect, depending on how much weightings different countries, different regions are placing on some of these dynamics. At the end of the day, it boils down to how secure, how do we maintain our own security, our own independent security within this more interconnected technological space? What does it mean for our potential to develop more economically? And what kind of influence do we have when we sit on the table as we begin to, within the more interconnected digital landscape in that sense? And so this is the background of my intervention. And so when we look at the global landscape, some kinds of trends, of course, beginning to crystallize and beginning to concretize around the growing importance of digital sovereignty across different countries, across different regions. If we look at the leading players globally, Europe, from a digital sovereignty perspective, is maintaining its traditional rights-based perspective. We can see that with the underpinnings of the GDPR having relevance from a rights perspective, regardless of wherever a European citizen is, whether in the context of the European border or even beyond, as it affects both the infrastructure and data that's related to every European citizen. This is very much still applicable from their own perspective in order to maintain and assert their digital independence within the global concourse. And then more recently, in the same line of rights-based approach, there's the European Cybersecurity Act as well, while GDPR focuses more on data protection and privacy. The Cybersecurity Act, on the converse, deals more with more pertinent cybersecurity issues. And then much more recent is the ongoing discussions around the Eurostack with regards to decoupling some of the tight dependencies of Europe with respect to the United States in that sense. And then we look at, on the converse, China, of course, maintaining a very clear state-led approach to digital sovereignty. From a technological perspective, the Digital Silk Road project within the confines of the Belt and Road Initiative is their flagship, state-led aggressive investments with regards to the more recent technological innovations around 5G, and more recently around artificial intelligence in that sense. And then for America, something of more of a concourse between what I would term a techno-nationalist approach and a market-oriented approach. So a little bit more making that transition from a purely market-led engagement in the technological space to an increasingly strong input and drive from the state in trying to maintain global leadership within the technology space in order to assert their digital sovereignty, because at the end of the day, when we speak of digital sovereignty, it becomes less and less of a private endeavor, and the state begins to have a very clear, significant input. And so America is making that shift in that sense, and we see from the CHIPS Act and the Science Act as well. These are some of the dynamics that are shaping the global importance of digital sovereignty globally. And so for Africa, it is not why these other regions that I've highlighted, at least we can understand what their clear positionalities are with respect to maintaining and asserting their digital independence in the global discourse as far as the digital evolution continues to spiral out. The situation for Africa is that it is underpinned, like so many other revolutions that has gone ahead before the current one, an infrastructure deficit, which is like a baggage, a digital infrastructure deficit, and so relying on mostly external-based infrastructure. Most of the data content from the continent is hosted outside the continent, constituting almost 20% of total population, global population. And so that has significant imperatives for the quantity of data that is being generated, even though we keep on talking about data scarcity. But if you sync that to the population of the continent, then that the data might not actually be scarce, but it might not just be locally, contextually curated. And because with less than 1% of data hosting capacities residing on the continent, that might make an appearance as if there is a clear data scarcity. And so the challenge is that the continent's data, like they say, is everywhere, trafficked, collected, stored via various international operators, network carriers, and the emerging super platforms. And so, what are the imperatives of this situation for the continent's independent security, sovereign economic independence, and the rights issue around data privacy? Those are the key questions for me. And from a policy perspective, I'm looking at how the continent is reacting. And at this exploratory phase, I'm just looking at the reaction first at the continental level. And what I find is that ultimately, the current position in terms of a reaction is with regards to localizing data and prescribing data protection laws. Why data protection laws might be more imperative? How do you localize what you can control? That becomes the nagging question there. And from a policy perspective in dealing with this reaction, what I also see is that there is currently, which is the crux of my intervention, is that there's current conflicting regional policy position that creates a complex regulatory terrain for Africa's digital future. If you look at the key policy instruments with respect to the continent, the AU Digital Transformation Strategy, 2020 to 2030, it supports localization with clear imprints along the lines of soon it will be necessary to ensure that localization of all personal data within the continent is embedded within the region. And the underlying rationale for this position is basically to emphasize the territorial sovereignty and control of citizens' data across the region. On the converse, contrary to that position, is the AU Data Policy Framework, much more recent, which was adopted in 2022. I was part of that process. The position with regards to data localization as a reaction from the continent with respect to digital sovereignty is conflicting to what the AU Digital Transformation Strategy posits. It opposes localization as a means to digital sovereignty. On the converse, on the contrary, it advocates for interoperability, trust frameworks, and cross-border data flows. So while it's saying we need to open up, it also recognizes the need that there should be in place trust frameworks to balance off that trade-off in that sense. And in more congruence to the AU Data Policy Framework, the AFCFTA Protocol on Digital Trade, which of course is not yet finalized, is in more alignment with the AU Data Policy Framework, prohibiting clearly localization of data, but allowing derogation for what it terms legitimate public policy or essential security. That I would lay some more emphasis as I go on. And the underlying rationale for this is to align with the global trade facilitation protocols while acknowledging the sovereign exceptions with respect to the countries that are involved from the continental position. However, as we can see, these key instruments draw two parallel lines with respect to data localization, which is the primary reactionary position with regards to digital sovereignty in respect to the continental perspectives on these emerging issues from a technology ecosystem perspective. And so these contradictions reveal quite a deep tension in how the continent perceives digital sovereignty, how it wants to deal with it in relation to the agglomerating effects around data protection, economic integration, how it is being conceptualized and operationalized within the continent. And so from this perspective, there are clear imperatives for me. The first one is that the continent needs to clarify a strategy